It is Independence Day, 2020. I'm Gabriel Huddleston, and this is Where the Battle Runs Thick. Today, I want to talk about, continue the discussion about masks. I want to talk about a couple different facets of this discussion. The first being the question, why draw the line here? Why draw the line in the sand? Why take a stand on a relatively minor issue? I touched on the "it's just a mask" argument in my last podcast, but I want to make a finessing of the conversation here. I'm not going to cover the exact same thing I covered in the last podcast, but there is overlap. So the question being, why draw the line here? The biblical pattern for resistance to government, overarchingly and throughout church history, has been the idea that we submit to government authority unless they command us to sin or command us not to do what God has commanded us to do. And the apostles say in the book of Acts, we must obey God rather than men. That is the consistent biblical teaching and the unified position of church history. And, for the record, I agree with that as a principle of submission to government and really to all godly authority. And indeed, in general, to all God-ordained jurisdictions, even when they are being exercised in an ungodly way. I would contend for submission above and beyond what the authority has the right to command, if we can do so in good conscience and in obedience to Scripture. So I just want to establish that, first of all, on a principial level, that I do agree with that in principle. And so we shouldn't, as Christians, have a heart that wants to cast off restraint and wants to say, well, hey, constitutionally, you can't put a seat or a speed limit sign up. You can't ticket me for not wearing my seatbelt. You don't have the constitutional right to do so. Well, that may be true, but as Christians, we should have a heart of submission. We should be the greatest citizens in the land. Governors should want Christian citizens because Christians have a desire to honor God by submitting to authority, even to unjust authority. Christian wives who have unbelieving husbands should testify to the glory of Christ by submitting to their husbands, even if their husbands' demands are beyond what a godly Christian husband would demand, within limitations. There are certainly points where she shouldn't submit to, whether it's abuse or commands to sin, etc. I'm not getting into that. My point being, where God has ordained authority, we as Christians should have a default position in our heart of, I want to submit. I want this authority to know that I submit to Christ, and as someone submitted to Christ, I love submitting to God-ordained jurisdictions. So that is a principle that I am not challenging here. So then the question arises, well, if you say that we should submit to the government unless they command us to sin or forbid us from righteousness, them telling us to wear a mask is not commanding us to sin. Aren't you contradicting yourself? And there's where I must plead for your patience as I try to explain to you where I'm at, my reasoning for where I'm at. This is not my blanket condemnation of every believer who wears a mask. I am not saying that this is cut and dry. This is a gray area, and in short, my contention is that we all have to draw a line somewhere, and I'm drawing my line sooner than others would. On the progression from mandatory masking to a mandatory vaccine ID chip, somewhere in that spectrum, you're probably going to want to draw the line, or I would argue you should, at least. We could make it even more dramatic. Let's say on the progression from mandatory masking to forbidding churches to meet. At some point, you got to draw the line, because the Bible commands us to meet. So, and Christians across the world meet in underground churches against the ruling, the commands of the government. They must obey God rather than men. I think as believers, we should clearly all be able to agree on that much, because that is commanded in Scripture, that we gather together, and we stand in a heritage of Christians who have gathered together in spite of government ordinance since the early church. So that much we should all be able to agree on. So the question simply is, where do you draw the line? We all agree that at some point you have to draw the line. So why am I drawing the line this early? First of all, I would not be drawing the line this early, well, from where I sit, from what I can see, if I were not an American. If I were a Roman Christian and we were living under Caesar, I would be masking up. As it stands right now, knowing that it is not a sin to wear a mask, I still sometimes do wear a mask. Just today, I was going to go into a restaurant and go up to the counter to get some food, and I saw someone in the restaurant in medical scrubs wearing a mask and kind of glaring at me as I was peeking in the door with no mask on. So I went to the car and I got my mask and I put my mask on. There's context. And sometimes I may have not worn a mask more from fear, or I may have worn a mask more from fear than from circumspectness. That I don't want to do. I want to act on courage and conviction. However, I'm not arguing that there's not a time where it's just contextually appropriate or wise to just put a mask on, because it's not a sin. We can do that. My contention with the non-mask thing is that I'm drawing the line earlier, and so here's why. Here's my biblical argument for why. Romans 13 tells us as Christians to submit to the governing authorities that God has ordained. Point number one, God has not ordained those authorities without limits. So there is a point where the Christian duty is to disobey government authority. We already covered that, and that is specifically when it commands what God forbids or forbids what God commands. That said, we have a heritage as American Christians. We are blessed by God with a heritage that in our nation, civil disobedience has a long and honored history. So, by not wearing a mask, this is not rank lawlessness. This is not anarchy. This is not on the same level as breaking into Target to steal a flat-screen TV. By not wearing a mask, this is in a very small way. I'm not, saying because I don't wear a mask, I am, I'm on the level with people who really face some serious persecution for their civil disobedience. But I am saying that in a small way, this stands in the long and time-honored tradition of American civil disobedience. We do have a heritage as American Christians that has to factor into our interpretation of Romans 13. Not interpreting Scripture by our culture, but rather understanding and applying Scripture wisely in the culture that God has placed us in. We do have a heritage from our forefathers based on biblical principle. They bled for our right to protest, to peacefully assemble, and even to keep and bear arms. We're not at that point yet, thank God, and I hope and pray we never do get to the point where the kind of resistance becomes necessary that our forefathers took up. But, so to sum up, that's point number one. Point number one, as Americans, we do have a heritage of lawful civil disobedience where there comes a point where by not submitting to the government as such, we are honoring the laws of the land. We are upholding American, what's the word? American liberty, the ideals of America's founding, in a way that honors the law of America. And I would say in a way that applies Romans 13. America was set up so that the people would be king, so to speak. It is a government of, by, and for the people. Part of the way that government was designed includes things like civil disobedience. So I'm not advocating rank anarchy and lawlessness. I'm advocating upholding the rule of law in a way that does apply Romans 13, that is respectful of government authority, but that does take a stand for liberty as we have received an inheritance as American Christians. So that's point number one. Now can I remember point number two? Point number two, there's civil disobedience as the time-honored tradition. So part of the heritage that we've received as American Christians, our forefathers, I remember Patrick Henry's speech about how they petitioned and they remonstrated and they prostrated themselves before the throne to implore its interposition between themselves and the British Parliament. And that's not just American heritage, that is biblical principle. Biblical principle is one of progressive conflict resolution. You look in Matthew 18, and what does Jesus say? He says, if you have an offense, you go to talk to the person, then you go with someone else to talk to the person, then you bring that person before the church, and then it proceeds to church discipline. There's this progression from minor reproof to major reproof. That's specifically in an individual and church level, but I believe the principle bears out in all jurisdictions. You start with Romans 12:18, if possible, so far as it depends on you, be at peace with all men. We want to be at peace. Anybody who's out there waving their "don't tread on me" flag, I have no problem with "don't tread on me" flags, but if your "don't tread on me" flag is representing a heart, or even your, okay, while I'm stepping on toes, if your Confederate flag, I have no problem with Confederate flags either, understood rightly. I have very much problem with racism, with the slave trade, etc. But I also believe that burning down all symbols is, well, that's another topic for another time. Lord willing, we'll get to Marxism and Black Lives Matter and all that in a different podcast. Got to stay on track here. So, if your "don't tread on me" flag is a symbol of your rebellious heart that says, I can't wait until the next great American Revolution so I can get all my guns and go start shooting, that's a problem. That's a big problem. That is not the Christian perspective. The Christian perspective is, if possible, so far as it depends on you, be at peace with all men. We want to give every possible avenue for peace without compromise, without cowardice. So how does that apply to masks? Well, here's my contention. We all agree that there's a line, that there's a point where you stop obeying the government, that perhaps there's even a point where it comes to armed resistance. My contention is we have a duty to petition and to remonstrate and to prostrate ourselves before the throne, quote unquote, to quote Patrick Henry, talking about the British, but in our case, first of all, it's not prostrating ourselves before the throne. We're Americans. We have a heritage. We don't bow to our government. But respectfully appealing, voting, civilly disobeying, speaking out, whatever the case may be, we have a duty to do that earlier on than when the battle lines are drawn and you've got to keep your powder dry. We have a duty to pursue every means of peaceful reconciliation before it gets to that point. Part of that, I see an application in the simple area of standing up against mandatory mask orders. By standing up against a mandatory mask order, we're pushing back now when it is something that I would still be willing to do. If a police officer is going to, arrest me, I'll put a mask on. It's not that big of a deal. It is not a moral issue. It is a liberty issue. It is a liberty issue that flows out of my understanding and conviction of biblical morality, but it is not something I can't do before God. So if it gets down to it, I'm not going to, pull out my guns and go start a war because I have to wear a mask. No, I'll wear a mask. But I would rather put my foot down, draw the line in the sand now as a method and means of petitioning and remonstrating with an unchecked and overreaching government than wait until it gets so bad that everybody's pulling out their guns, but we never really pushed back at any point where there might have still been a chance to have peaceful dialogue. So that's point number 2. That drawing the line in the sand with masks is part of a means to seek peace, to seek to honor governing authorities, to seek to avoid more exacerbated conflict by taking a stand earlier on. Point number 3 is that by not wearing a mask, am, in my small way, showing solidarity with other Americans across the nation who are standing up, who do see this as a liberty issue. With the sheriff that I just saw the article, I believe it was in Washington, the sheriff who is telling the people in his jurisdiction, don't be a sheep, don't wear a mask, defy these mask orders. To stand in solidarity with business owners who are saying, no, I'm not closing my business down again. By not wearing a mask, in my small way, I am standing up with those folks. And I want to show solidarity with them. If I am going to encourage pastors that they should not keep their churches closed indefinitely, they should break the law and open church. And I do believe that we should have shown submission when the lockdown orders first came out. That should have been our default. I know that my church did. We met online for like a month and a half. And now in Arizona, it's now legal again to meet as churches, and we have been. But with that said, with that as our default, there's a point, and I believe we're at that point, and I would encourage pastors to open their churches. I would support business people who are saying, I'm not shutting my business down again, and I want to, in my small way, put my money where my mouth is. If I'm going to tell them that they should practice civil disobedience, how can I not do the same? I want to stand in solidarity with them for the cause of liberty. And again, this is not abject liberty. This is liberty based in biblical principle. And by not wearing a mask, it's in my small way, it's my opportunity to do so. So there are three principles for why I draw the line in the sand here where I do. That's my argument. Now you take it, you pray about it, you walk it out before the Lord, and maybe for you this isn't the place to draw the line in the sand. For me, those are at least three reasons why. Number one, our heritage as American Christians and our duty as American Christians. Number two, the avoidance of conflict by taking a stand sooner rather than later. And number three, solidarity with and the support of others who are trying to take the same stand. I think I recall. Maybe I got that first point wrong. But anyway, you just heard the podcast. So the other thing I wanted to cover was the question of COVID itself. Don't you take COVID seriously? Isn't this something severe? Aren't you afraid of killing grandma? Long story short. And the answer to that question, in short, is, well, yes, of course. I certainly do not wish to bring harm to anybody. And so, again, there are two principles that you have to hold in tension here. Number one is you have to hold the principle of loving others, caring for their health. You need to, as a Christian, you have to take that principle into play. And if your perspective on this whole thing is just kind of like, who cares? I'm just not wearing a mask because they can't tell me what to do. That's a problem. That is not wise. That is not loving. We need to be willing to give up our rights, our liberties to love others. You have to hold that principle, but you have to hold it in tension with other principles, other questions that need to be asked. So you're going to have to draw the line somewhere. You do that between you and the Lord. All I can tell you is why. So that was my why for the mask issue. Now here's my take on COVID. I am not an expert. I am not a doctor. I am not a statistician. I am a layman making observations, and I readily admit I could be wrong. However, the first thing that I would urge, especially for Christians, because I see this attitude online, especially, well, I don't know if I can say that. I see this attitude online with some in these debates where it's just kind of this cold turkey, point blank. If you don't agree with me, you're a terrible Christian. What's wrong with you? The biblical principles are obvious. And I would contend, no, that is not at all true. There are a lot of very good questions to be asked on both sides. And people who genuinely love the Lord and love others can come down on both sides of this issue. We must approach it in humility and with love for one another, and leaving room for Christian liberty and for one another to be right and to be wrong. So I admit I could be wrong, and I would encourage you, if you disagree with me, to admit that you too could be wrong. We need to seek God's face together, walk it out in wisdom, And then at the end of the day, we trust in His sovereignty and His grace. It is for us to do our best to be faithful. That said, when it comes to COVID, I am skeptical. Obviously, it's a real disease. How it is being spread, how it started, I don't know. Is there government conspiracy behind it? I don't know. I'm certainly open to that idea. I think to take a perspective that, that's just silly conspiracy theory and, that's impossible. No, that's not impossible. That's completely within the realm of possibility. We've seen that all throughout history, and the Bible leads us to an understanding of the depravity of man. It's definitely possible. It's also awful convenient, the timing, especially the timing of this spike in Arizona. That it leads to questions, but I don't have conclusions in this matter. I'm not making an argument for, it was the government, it was it was the Clinton Foundation. I don't know. I don't know who or what was behind it. Ultimately, God is sovereign over all things, over the actions of governments, of individuals, and of viruses. With that said, I do not trust the media or the government's official stance on it for a couple of reasons that are pretty well summed up in the old adage, fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. The entire national economy was shut down, causing incredible devastation for months. And the result, as far as the disease is concerned, was severely underwhelming. You can say, the reason the disease was underwhelming was because we all shut down. But there are statistics that both sides throw around that at least tell us that is a dubious proposition. We don't really know what's going on with COVID. We don't really know what is the best approach to it. But as a nation, we defaulted to a draconian crackdown instead of defaulting to liberty. So that's point number one, is we don't really know. But beyond that, we have the state who cried COVID. And the first time they cried COVID, we all ran to the top of the hill and looked around, and there was no COVID. And now they're crying COVID again. And now listen, we just had riots in the streets, and for 2 weeks, the media completely forgot about COVID. It was all about the riots. It was all about Black Lives Matter. And COVID was a non-issue, and the CDC released a statement, as I understand it, from the headlines I've seen online. The CDC released a statement saying that they're not concerned that these riots are a risk for spreading COVID. However, they do not encourage participating in protests against stay-at-home orders because that does have the risk of spreading COVID. Well, that is blatant political hypocrisy. And when you talk like that, you undermine your credibility. So no, I do not default to trusting you when you say, okay, now that the riots are no longer the political fodder we're looking for, hey, COVID's a big deal again. I'm sorry, I don't default to trusting you on that. So yes, I am skeptical about COVID, about its dangers. I see that the case numbers are still increasing. I also see that the death numbers are decreasing, which is really what we should hope to see. That, from my limited understanding, presents the reality that it looks like we are headed more towards a herd immunity where the most vulnerable are keeping themselves protected and the broader society, the less vulnerable people, they're getting COVID, which is good. It's spreading through the society. The more people get it, the closer we get to herd immunity, and that is a good thing, from my understanding. So all that to say, the statistics are questionable. There are good questions to ask, and the government and media have severely undermined their own credibility when it comes to COVID-19. With all that being said, do I believe that it does present a danger to high-risk individuals? Absolutely. Absolutely it does. And is it loving to bear that in mind? Absolutely. And if you're going to go to a nursing home, I would recommend wearing a mask. That would probably be a wise idea. If you're going to be around someone with compromised health or someone who's just uncomfortable about it, and you know that, then wear a mask. I'm not denying that COVID does present a threat. I'm contending that the threat that we face to liberty is a more dangerous one than the threat that we face from COVID, while also the risk that we run by not wearing a mask is significantly low. You may disagree with me on that, but that's kind of my point. We have to hold those two truths in tension. We are weighing risks here. We are making calculations. And if you come down on the other side of the calculation from me, that's fine. But let's not play this game where it's, oh, well, you just don't care. You just want grandmas to die. Or, oh, well, you're just okay with a one world totalitarian regime. No, we're all trying to make a wise decision here. So may God give you wisdom. At the end of the day, we got to draw the line somewhere. Let's seek God's face. Let's apply the Proverbs. Above all, get wisdom. Take these principles, hold them in tension, love your neighbors. Love your neighbors both by protecting them from disease and by protecting them from tyranny. Seek the face of God and trust Him. And then we just walk this out and we cast ourselves on His sovereignty, because at the end of the day, He is wise. He knows what is going on, and we don't. We're just trying to walk this out. So I hope that those principles gave you some things to think about. I hope they're helpful in explaining some of the things that I'm talking about, some of my rationale. If you're enjoying this podcast, please share it. Please rate it, review it. And in the meantime, don't be afraid. God is on the throne. His kingdom will come. His will be done. And the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. Until next time, I'm Gabriel Huddleston, and this is Where the Battle Runs Thick.